The day I died, my brother drove a rusted crowbar into my skull, while my fiancé watched calmly, eating my last can of peaches. When I gasped awake, staring at my pristine ceiling, it was exactly 30 days before the frost spore apocalypse. I knew the nightmare that was coming. So when Derek shoved me aside to snatch the glowing blue meteorite right out of my hands, the artifact that granted the legendary survival system, he thought he'd stolen my destiny. He didn't know the system was a parasitic death sentence. I just smiled, quietly, slipping our grandfather's battered iron pendant into my pocket. They had no idea. The memory of cold is something you can never truly wash out of your bones. I woke up thrashing my hands, clawing at my own throat, expecting the agonizing burn of the frost spores tearing through my lungs. Instead, my fingers met warm, unblemished skin. I sucked in a massive breath. The air didn't taste like copper-rotting flesh and ozone. It tasted like vanilla air freshener and old wood. I rolled out of bed and hit the hardwood floor, my knees trembling. My eyes darted to the digital clock on my nightstand. October 12th, 8 a.m. 30 days. Exactly 1 month before the sky would tear open, raining down the crystalline spores that would plunge global temperatures to minus 60 degrees and mutate half the population into mindless frozen husks. I dragged myself to the bathroom mirror. The gaunt, scarred, half-starved survivor who had spent 3 years fighting for scraps was gone. Staring back at me was a healthy, 26-year-old man. I was back. The universe, in some twisted stroke of mercy or cruel irony, had hit the reset button. But I didn't have time to process the miracle of my regression. The date meant something else. Today was the day we were supposed to clear out Grandad Arthur's basement. Today was the day I found the core. I threw on a hoodie and practically flew down the stairs. The house was quiet, the morning sun filtering through the blinds, in a way that made my chest ache with grief for a world that didn't know it was already on death row. I bypassed the kitchen and unlocked the heavy oak door leading to the basement. The smell of dust and mothballs hit me. In my previous life, I had been diligently sorting through Arthur's old war trunks when I found the false bottom in a footlocker. Inside had been 2 things: a fist-sized, glowing blue geode and a dull, heavy iron pendant shaped like a teardrop. When I had touched the geode, it dissolved into my skin, granting me the Apocalypse survival system. For 3 years, that system had kept me alive, but it had also turned me into its slave. It demanded impossible, horrific tasks. Kill 3 survivors to unlock a loaf of bread. Harvest the organs of the infected to upgrade your shelter. It was a parasite that fed on humanity, slowly driving its host insane. Derek and my fiancée, Sarah, had grown resentful of my power, but they gladly reaped the benefits. Right up until the moment the system demanded a blood sacrifice, and they decided I was worth more dead than alive. I reached the footlocker in the corner of the damp basement. My hands moved with practiced precision, prying up the false wooden bottom. A soft, pulsing azure light bathed my face. The geode. Next to it sat the rusted iron pendant. Well, look what you found. I froze. I didn't need to turn around to recognize the arrogant, grating voice of my older brother Derek. Footsteps echoed on the wooden stairs. Behind him, peeking over his shoulder, with her perfectly manicured nails and innocent eyes, was Sarah, my fiancée, the woman who had watched me bleed out on the ice. I told you, he was down here sneaking through the good stuff. Derek sneered, stepping into the dim light. He was built thicker than me, a former college linebacker who never let anyone forget his glory days. Granddad always liked you best. Probably hid the real inheritance down here, right? I stood up slowly, keeping my body between them and the footlocker. My heart pounded, a primal urge screaming at me to grab the nearest heavy object and cave his head in right now. But murder, in the old world, meant prison, and I couldn't prep for the apocalypse from a cell. "It's just junk, Derek," I said, forcing my voice to stay level. "Move," Derek demanded, shoving his forearm into my chest. In my past life, I had fought back, we had wrestled, and my hand had accidentally smashed onto the geode, absorbing it. This time, I let him push me. I stumbled backward, putting on a show of weak protest. Derek peered into the trunk, his eyes widening, as the blue light reflected off his face. "What the hell is that?" he breathed. Without hesitation, his greedy hands reached out and snatched the glowing blue rock. "Derek, wait. Don't touch that." Sarah gasped, stepping forward. But it was too late. The moment his fingers closed around it, the geode shattered into a million points of light, swirling up his arm and sinking directly into his veins. Derek let out a sharp cry, dropping to his knees. "Derek!" Sarah shrieked, rushing to his side, shooting me a venomous glare. "What did you do to him?" "I didn't do anything," I said quietly. Derek gasped, his eyes flying open. They flashed with a brief neon blue light. A slow, euphoric grin spread across his face. He looked at his hands, then up at the empty air, as if reading something invisible. I knew exactly what he was seeing. System initialized. Host accepted. "I can see things," Derek whispered, his voice trembling with a god complex being born in real time. "Stats, quests. It's a survival system, like in those novels. It says the world is ending in 30 days. Sarah looked at him like he was crazy. "Derek, what are you talking about?" He stood up, towering over me, his chest puffed out. He looked at me, not as a brother, but as a peasant. "It chose me," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You found it, but it knew you were too weak. I'm the chosen host. I'm going to be a king when the world burns, little brother." I looked at him, seeing the ghost of the man who would one day murder me for a can of food. I felt no anger anymore, only a profound, chilling pity. "You're right, Derek," I said, my voice soft. "It chose you. Congratulations." He sneered, wrapping an arm around Sarah's waist, pulling her close. She looked confused, but didn't pull away. They were already aligning. "Stay out of my way from now on," he warned. "I've got work to do." They turned and walked up the stairs, Derek excitedly whispering to Sarah about leveling up. Once the door clicked shut, I let out a long, slow breath. I looked down into the empty footlocker. Well, not entirely empty. I reached down and picked up the rusted iron pendant. In my previous life, I had ignored it, but years later, I had learned the truth from a dying warlord. The system was just a corrupted terminal. The pendant was the administrator's key, a legendary artifact known as the Genesis Vault. I smiled, slipping the cold iron into my pocket. "Have fun with the curse, Derek. I'll take the real prize." I locked the door to the basement, ensuring Derek wouldn't come back down to gloat. The house was already vibrating with his manic energy upstairs. I could hear him shouting, pacing the living room, barking at Sarah about experience points and inventory slots. I walked over to Granddad's old workbench, my hands remarkably steady, for a man who had just returned from the dead. I pulled a utility knife from the rack. I didn't hesitate. I pressed the blade to my left thumb and sliced. A bright bead of blood welled up. I pulled the rusted iron pendant from my pocket. It was heavy, shaped like a teardrop, with strange, microscopic geometric patterns etched into its surface that you could only see if the light hit it just right. I pressed my bleeding thumb against the center of the metal. For a second, nothing happened. Then the iron grew, searing hot. I gritted my teeth, refusing to let go. The rust flaked away instantly, revealing a surface of liquid obsidian that seemed to absorb the dim light of the basement. The blood sank into the stone, disappearing. A gentle chiming sound echoed directly inside my mind, far different from the harsh, robotic voice of Derek's system. Genesis vault-bound. Biometrics confirmed. Welcome, administrator. The air in front of me shimmered, ripping open like a curtain of water. There was no flashy screen, no obnoxious quest logs demanding I kill people. Just a quiet, stable tear in reality. I stepped through. I found myself standing on a lush, grassy hill under an artificial sky that radiated a warm, perfect, golden hour light. I spun around, taking it all in. The air was incredibly fresh-smelling of ozone and pine. Below the hill stretched an absolutely massive, pristine warehouse complex made of gleaming white composite metal. Beyond the warehouses were acres of rich, dark, tillable soil, a sparkling freshwater lake, and a dense, quiet forest. It was a pocket dimension, a perfect, isolated ecosystem. Current storage capacity, infinite. Time flow, status frozen, for non-living matter. Growth rate for living matter, 10 times standard. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my chest. The system Derek had stolen offered a meager 10 cubic foot inventory that charged you energy points every time you accessed it. This was a sanctuary. Anything I placed in the warehouse would remain in the exact condition it entered. Hot food would stay hot forever. Ice wouldn't melt. Meat wouldn't rot. And the soil, 10 times normal growth rate. A crop of potatoes that usually took 100 days would be ready in 10. They really had no idea, I whispered to the empty air. I willed myself out of the vault, instantly appearing back in the basement. The spatial tear vanished without a trace. My thumb had completely healed. I had 30 days. 30 days to liquidate every asset, empty every account, and hoard enough supplies to last a lifetime. And I needed to do it right under the nose of my newly overpowered brother. I headed upstairs. When I walked into the kitchen, I found Derek doing furious, frantic push-ups on the linoleum floor. Sweat dripped from his nose. Sarah was sitting at the counter, sipping coffee, looking at him with a mix of awe and concern. 98, 99, 100. Derek gasped, collapsing onto his back. He stared at the ceiling, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. Yes, quest complete, plus 10 strength points. He jumped up, barely looking tired anymore. The system was already altering his physiology, hooking him on the dopamine rush of instant gratification. He looked at me, puffing out his chest. Look at you, Caleb. Still weak, still ordinary, he mocked. The system just gave me a beginner's daily quest. Do 100 push-ups, get superhuman strength. You have no idea the kind of power I'm tapping into. That's great, Derek, I said neutrally, grabbing an apple from the bowl on the counter. What else did it tell you? He scoffed, grabbing a bottle of water. It told me the frost rot is coming. The world's going to freeze and zombies are going to take over. I have to build a fortress. It gave me a list of materials I need to gather. I'm going to take Granddad's truck. Go for it, I said, tossing him the keys from the hook. He caught them, looking slightly suspicious at how easily I yielded. You're not going to try and stop me beg to join my party, he taunted. I'm just a normal guy, Derek. I wouldn't want to slow you down. He laughed a cruel, harsh sound. Damn right you wouldn't. Sarah, come on. We're going to the hardware store. The system says I need to buy 50 bags of concrete for a barrier wall. As they hurried out the front door, I took a bite of the apple. Concrete. The idiot was going to build a concrete wall to stop a virus that spread through the air and froze the atmosphere. Let him waste his time and his money. I had bigger moves to make. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It belonged to Gregory Finch, the senior asset manager at the bank where our grandfather had left our trust funds. Finch, I said when he picked up. It's Caleb. Ah, Caleb. Good morning. Gregory's smooth, practiced voice came through. To what do I owe the pleasure? How are the renovations on the estate coming along? I'm halting them, I said, walking into the living room and staring out the window at Derek's truck, pulling out of the driveway. In fact, I want to liquidate everything. There was a long pause on the line. Everything, Caleb, your grandfather left you a portfolio worth nearly $4 million. That's blue chip stocks, municipal bonds, and the house itself. Liquidating it all would incur massive penalties. I don't care about the penalties, Gregory. I need cash. All of it. Fast. How fast? He asked, his tone shifting from friendly to strictly professional. I want the first $1 million wired to my account by tomorrow morning. Start drafting the paperwork for the house. I'm selling it. Caleb, this is highly irregular. Does your brother know about this? Derek's half of the trust is his problem. I replied coldly. This is my half. Do it, Gregory, or I'm moving to a firm that will. Fine. Come into the office at noon. We'll start the transfers. I hung up. $4 million minus penalties. It wouldn't mean a damn thing in a month when money became worthless paper used for kindling. But right now, in the golden age of capitalism, it was the ultimate superpower. I grabbed my jacket. It was time to start shopping. I needed weapons, industrial generators, water filtration systems, and enough food to feed an army. Derek could play around with his concrete and push-ups. I was going to buy out the city. The bank smelled like lemon polish and old money. Gregory Finch sat across from me, his expensive silk tie perfectly knotted, staring at the transfer authorization papers as if they were written in a dead language. He slid the heavy oak pen across the desk. You understand that by breaking these CDs early and liquidating the mutual funds, you are taking a nearly 20% penalty. Caleb, Gregory asked, his voice tight with financial puritanism. This is financial suicide. Sign the wire transfer. Gregory, I replied, clicking the pen. I scribbled my signature across the dotted line without breaking eye contact. By 1 p.m., my offshore and domestic accounts were flush with liquid cash. $3.2 million. It was a staggering amount of money, but in the face of a global freeze, it was just a ticking timer. Money only had value as long as people believed in tomorrow. I had 29 days before tomorrow ceased to exist. My first stop wasn't a grocery store. It was the industrial shipping district on the outskirts of the city. I needed bulk, and I needed discretion. I parked my rented SUV outside a massive corrugated steel warehouse belonging to a man named Elias Cobb. Cobb was a logistics broker, a polite term for a gray market liquidator who moved excess military and industrial freight without asking too many questions. I walked into his office, a dingy room smelling of stale cigars and machine oil. Cobb, A massive man with a graying beard and suspenders looked up from his ledger. "We're closed to retail walk-ins, kid." Cobb grunted, not even bothering to put down his pen. "I'm not retail," I said, pulling a cashier's check for $50,000 from my jacket and placing it flat on his desk. "That's the retainer for your time today. I need to charter 4 commercial transport trucks, and I need access to your wholesale procurement network. Today." Cobb stared at the check, then slowly looked up at me. The annoyance in his eyes vanished, replaced by the sharp, predatory gleam of a businessman. "What exactly are you looking to procure?" "Everything," I said. For the next 6 hours, I became Cobb's best nightmare. I bought out entire lots of surplus. We started with food. I ordered 300 pallets of high-calorie military MREs, 50 tons of vacuum-sealed rice and beans, and enough freeze-dried vegetables to feed a small town for a decade. Then came the hardware. I purchased 10 industrial-grade diesel generators, massive spools of copper wire commercial water, filtration units, and heavy-duty solar arrays. But the most crucial purchase was the cold weather gear. I didn't just buy winter coats. I bought extreme environment Arctic exploration suits. I bought aerogel insulated boots, thermal bivouac sacks rated for -80 degrees, and thousands of chemical heat packs. "You building a colony on Mars, kid?" Cobb asked, wiping sweat from his forehead as he tallied the final invoice. "Something like that," I muttered. "I need all of this delivered to the abandoned textile mill on Route 9 by Friday. No delays. For this kind of cash, I'll drive the trucks myself," Cobb assured me. By the time I returned home, the sun had set. The house was practically vibrating with loud, aggressive hip-hop music. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, nearly tripping over a massive pile of scrap metal copper pipes and broken electronics piled in the hallway. Derek was in the living room, but he didn't look like my brother anymore. He had stripped off his shirt, and his body was flushed, veins bulging against his skin like thick, purple cords. He was swinging a heavy sledgehammer into our grandfather's antique oak dining table, splintering it into kindling. "Derek, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted over the music. He stopped chest heaving, his eyes locking onto me. They were dilated practically entirely black, with a faint, unnatural blue rim around the iris. The system was already altering his neurochemistry. "Resource gathering," Derek panted, dropping the sledgehammer. He wiped a line of dirty sweat from his face. "The system requires base materials: wood, iron, copper. It breaks them down in my inventory to generate build points for my shelter." I looked at the destroyed antique table. "You're destroying the house for points." "The house doesn't matter," Derek snapped, taking a threatening step toward me. His muscles twitched. The system gave him strength, but it demanded a massive caloric intake to sustain the rapid tissue growth. He looked ravenous, like a starving animal. "The frost rot is coming. I need to build a level 2 barricade. But the system needs more. It requires pure elements." He lunged forward, grabbing the collar of my jacket. The sheer force of his grip lifted me onto my toes. "I need your half of the trust fund, Caleb." He growled, his breath smelling horribly metallic, like old pennies. "I need to buy gold and silver. The system converts precious metals into premium credits. Give me your bank card." In my past life, this was the moment he had broken my jaw. He had beaten me until I gave him the PIN numbers to everything I owned. But I wasn't the terrified victim anymore. I looked down at his white-knuckled grip, then up into his manic eyes. "Okay, I choked out, playing the coward. "Okay, just let me go." He shoved me backward. I stumbled, reaching into my wallet. I pulled out a secondary debit card, an account I had loaded with exactly $10,000. It was a drop in the bucket, but to a junkie looking for a fix, it would be enough to distract him. "The PIN is 4492. I coughed, handing it over. "There's 10 grand in there. Take it." Derek snatched the card, his face lighting up with a greedy, psychotic grin. "See, was that so hard? You're finally learning your place, little brother." He turned away, screaming for Sarah to get her coat because they were going to the jewelry store. I stood in the ruined hallway, watching them leave. I rubbed my throat, a cold smile touching my lips. Let him feed his parasite. My real wealth was safely hidden, and the clock was ticking down. By day 15, the atmosphere in the house had become suffocating. The weather outside was still a mild, crisp autumn, but inside, the chill of madness had firmly set in. I barely slept at the house anymore. I spent my days at the abandoned textile mill on Route 9, waiting for Cobb's deliveries. When the massive 18-wheelers rolled in and unloaded mountains of crates, pallets, and fuel drums, I waited until the drivers left. Then I went to work. The Genesis vault was a marvel of spatial engineering. I would stand in front of a towering stack of MREs, press my thumb to the iron pendant, and open the tear in reality. It didn't require me to carry everything by hand. The vault responded to my intent. I would place my hand on the wooden pallets, and with a soft, vacuum-like whoosh, the entire stack would vanish from the dusty mill and reappear neatly organized in the gleaming white warehouses of my pocket dimension. It was intoxicating. I spent hours inside the vault, organizing my kingdom. I drove a forklift around the pristine, climate-controlled aisles, categorizing my empire of survival. In the agricultural sector, I planted seeds in the rich, dark earth: tomatoes, potatoes, carrots, and wheat. Because of the vault's 10 times growth acceleration, tiny green shoots were already pushing through the soil within 24 hours. While the rest of the world was about to starve, I was building an infinite garden. But back in the real world, the cost of Derek's blessing was becoming horrifyingly apparent. I returned to the house late one evening to find the front door wide open. A sickening coppery smell drifted from the kitchen. I drew the 9mm pistol I had purchased from Cobb, keeping it hidden behind my leg, as I moved silently down the hallway. I found Sarah sitting on the living room floor, her knees pulled to her chest, rocking back and forth. She looked terrible. Her flawless makeup was gone, her hair was greasy and matted, and a dark, ugly bruise bloomed across her left cheekbone. "Sarah," I whispered. She flinched, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Caleb," she sobbed, her voice barely a croak. "He's changing. It hurts him. The system hurts him. Where is he?" She pointed a trembling finger toward the kitchen. I stepped into the doorway and froze. Derek was hunched over the kitchen island. He had caught a large raccoon that had been digging in our trash. The animal was dead, its neck snapped. But that wasn't what turned my stomach. Derek wasn't just dissecting it. He was draining its blood into a mixing bowl, his hands stained crimson. "Derek," I said sharply. He whipped around. He looked like a ghoul. He had lost at least 30 pounds of fat, leaving him dangerously vascular. His skin was pale, and his eyes were completely bloodshot. The blue rings around his irises pulsed like a warning light. "Vitality potions." Derek muttered, his voice raspy and disjointed. He gestured to the bowl of blood with a bloody knife. The system, it demands organic material to heal the micro-tears in my muscles. Leveling up tears me apart, Caleb. I need protein. I need blood to synthesize the healing drafts. The system wasn't generating magic out of thin air. It was a parasite. It forced the host to push their physical limits beyond human capacity, causing massive internal damage, and then demanded the host harvest organic matter to repair themselves. It was turning him into a predator. You hit Sarah. I stated, my voice cold. Derek blinked, looking confused for a second, before his expression hardened into a scowl. She was crying. The noise was interrupting my interface. She doesn't understand the sacrifice required to become a Vanguard class. I'm protecting her. You look like a monster, Derek. I look like a survivor, he roared, slamming the bloody knife onto the counter. You think you're so smart sneaking around, minding your own business. The system warned me about the unawakened. It said, you'll turn on me when the food runs out. Maybe I should harvest you right now for the extra XP. He took a step toward me. I raised my right hand, leveling the 9mm directly at the center of his chest. Derek froze. He looked at the gun, then back at my face. He expected fear, but all I had for him was a dead, empty stare. Your system might make you strong, Derek, I said softly, but it doesn't make you bulletproof. Not at level 3. Step back. His jaw clenched. The neon blue light in his eyes flared, processing the threat. The system was calculating the odds, and clearly taking a hollow point to the heart wasn't survivable yet. He slowly backed down, raising his bloody hands in a mock surrender. Fine, keep your little toy, he spat. But the countdown is at 12 days. When the sky freezes, you'll be begging me for a place behind my barricades. I lowered the gun, but didn't put it away. I won't be here in 12 days. I turned and walked to my bedroom to pack the last of my essential clothes. I was moving out. The house was no longer safe, and there was no point in pretending anymore. My warehouse in the vault was fully stocked. My underground bunker, a retrofitted Cold War silo I had purchased anonymously, 2 states over, was prepped and waiting. As I carried my duffel bag out the front door, ignoring Sarah's pleading gaze, I looked up at the night sky. It was October 29th. The stars were usually bright this time of year, but tonight there was a strange, hazy occlusion blocking them out. I reached out a hand. A single crystalline flake drifted down from the darkness, landing on my palm. It wasn't snow. It didn't melt. It was a perfectly geometric, pale blue spore. The timeline had shifted. The frost rot wasn't coming in 12 days. It was starting right now. I stared at the pale blue spore resting on my palm. It didn't melt. Instead, it seemed to pulse, emitting a microscopic mist of pure, biting cold. In my past life, the frost rot hadn't started until late November. The system had given a strict 30-day countdown. But looking at the sky, watching millions of these glowing geometric flakes begin to cascade through the hazy atmosphere, I realized a terrifying truth. Derek wasn't the only one who had found a system core. The timeline hadn't randomly shifted. It had accelerated because the parasites had reached critical mass. Too many hosts had awakened globally, triggering the invasion protocol early. I brushed the spore off my glove and sprinted to my heavily modified Ford F-35, parked on the street. I threw my duffel bag into the passenger seat, cranked the ignition, and blasted the heater. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The lights in my grandfather's house were flickering wildly. Through the living room window, I could see Derek standing frozen, his head tilted back staring at the ceiling. His system was giving him the news. The tutorial was over. I hit the gas, navigating the winding suburban roads toward the interstate. I needed to get to my bunker in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a 3-hour drive under normal conditions. Tonight, it was going to be a gauntlet. I flipped on the radio, cycling through the AM emergency bands. The panic was already setting in. I tuned into a national broadcast. The voice of David Muir, the normally composed ABC News anchor, filled the cabin. He didn't sound composed tonight. His voice was trembling, cutting through static. Reports of a localized atmospheric collapse. The National Weather Service is calling it an unprecedented meteorological anomaly. Temperatures in Chicago have dropped 40 degrees in the last 20 minutes. Authorities are urging everyone to stay indoors, seal your windows, and do not, I repeat, do not inhale the blue particulate falling. The broadcast cut out, replaced by the screech of an emergency alert tone. The temperature gauge on my dashboard was plummeting in real time. 50 degrees, 40, 30. By the time I hit the highway, it was 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and ice was rapidly forming on the asphalt. The frost spores didn't just bring cold, they catalyzed it, freezing moisture in the air instantly. Cars were spinning out everywhere. I engaged the 4-wheel drive and plowed through the mounting snow and abandoned vehicles. People were fleeing their cars, screaming, as the spores touched their exposed skin. I watched in horror as a man, stumbling along the shoulder, inhaled a thick lungful of the glowing blue snow. He stopped dead. His veins turned a vicious, luminescent blue, visible through his neck. He convulsed, once his eyes rolling back, before he let out a shrieking, inhuman wail. The first of the husks. I kept driving. I had to compartmentalize the empathy that had gotten me killed in my first life. I couldn't save them. It took 6 agonizing hours, but I finally breached the heavy timberline of the Blue Ridge foothills and arrived at the disguised entrance of my bunker. It was an old decommissioned Department of Defense communications relay station, buried deep into the granite. I pulled the truck into the camouflaged garage, keyed in my biometric passcode, and sealed the blast doors just as the temperature outside hit -20. Inside the bunker was a marvel. I had spent $500,000 outfitting the living quarters, but the real treasure was the vault. I walked into the main command center, stripped off my jacket, and booted up the surveillance terminal. Before I left the city, I had hidden several micro cameras in my old house. I needed to know what Derek and his parasite were doing. The feed on monitor 3 flickered to life, showing the living room. The house was freezing. The windows had completely frosted over. Derek was pacing like a caged tiger, wrapped in every blanket he could find. Sarah was huddled on the couch, shivering violently, her lips blue. The system lied. Derek screamed at the empty air, smashing a lamp against the wall. You said 12 days. You said I had time to gather steel. He stopped suddenly, his eyes widening. He listened to the invisible voice. Phase 1 initiated. Derek repeated his voice, dropping to a frantic whisper. What do you mean, host saturation? There are others. How many? I watched the realization wash over my brother's face. He wasn't a king. He was just a pawn in a massive, twisted battle royale. Suddenly, Derek grabbed his head, dropping to his knees, and screaming in agony. The system was penalizing him for failing to complete his barricade quest before the freeze. I watched as the veins on his arms bulged and blackened. He writhed on the floor for 10 minutes before finally going still. When he stood back up, the humanity was entirely gone from his eyes. They were glowing, solid, terrifying blue. He turned to Sarah, who was sobbing in terror. "The system requires fuel." Derek said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. It sounded mechanical. "Heat synthesis requires organic carbon. Stand up, Sarah." I reached out and shut off the monitor. I couldn't watch. Derek had made his choice the moment he stole the meteorite, and Sarah had made hers when she stood by him. The world above was dead. Down here, I was the administrator of my own universe. I touched the cold iron pendant around my neck, opened the tier into the Genesis vault, and stepped inside to harvest my first crop of perfectly ripe, sun-warmed tomatoes. 2 months. That's how long it took for the old world to be completely buried under the ice. According to the shortwave radio broadcasts I occasionally picked up, the global temperature had stabilized at a balmy -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Major cities were tombs. Governments had fractured into isolated military remnants. The infected husks roamed the blizzards, mindless frozen zombies, driven only by the instinct to spread the spores. I lived like a ghost of luxury. Inside the Genesis vault, time didn't touch my supplies. I ate perfectly seared Wagyu steaks, drank vintage bourbon, and breathed air that smelled of pine and fresh rain. My bunker was powered by a geothermal tap, keeping the ambient temperature at a comfortable 72 degrees. But staying holed up forever was a tactical error. My past life had taught me that information was the most valuable currency in the apocalypse. I needed to know what the system hosts were doing. I geared up in my extreme environment Arctic suit, a heavily insulated battery-heated exoskeleton designed for deep-sea oil rig workers. I strapped a customized AR-15 to my chest, loaded with incendiary rounds, and slung a tactical shotgun over my back. I looked like an astronaut prepped for war. Leaving the bunker was like stepping onto an alien planet. The Blue Ridge Mountains were encased in a thick layer of blue-tinted ice. The trees were frozen solid, shattering like glass when the wind howled through them. The sky was a perpetual, suffocating twilight. I hiked down the mountain for 3 hours until I reached the ruins of an old logging road. That's where I found them, a group of 4 scavengers huddled around the smoking remains of a frozen engine block, trying desperately to light a fire with wet road flares. They were emaciated, wrapped in layers of filthy torn clothing. One of them, a young woman missing 3 fingers to frostbite, looked up as my boots crunched on the ice. She raised a rusty hunting rifle with shaking hands. "Easy." My voice boomed through the external speakers of my helmet. I slowly raised my hands. "I'm not here for your gear. You look like you need heat." I tossed a bundle of chemical heat packs and 3 MREs onto the snow between us. They stared at the pristine high-calorie food like it was holy scripture. The woman dropped the rifle, and they scrambled for the packs, tearing them open and pressing them against their freezing faces. "Where did you get this?" A man with a thick, frost-covered beard gasped, ripping into an MRE. "The pit zone is completely dry. The butcher took it all." "The pit zone?" I asked, stepping closer. "You came from Pittsburgh." "Fled," the woman corrected her teeth, chattering. "It's a slaughterhouse up there. The blue-eyed butcher took over the steel mills. He's got some kind of magic. He can pull weapons out of thin air. He forces people to scavenge the ruins. If you don't bring back enough copper or electronics for his offerings, He throws you to the husks. My blood ran cold, and it had nothing to do with the weather. Derek. He had survived, and he had migrated north to the industrial hub of Pittsburgh to feed his system's insatiable hunger for raw materials. "Why didn't you stay?" I asked. "At least he has walls." The bearded man let out a dark, broken laugh. "Because of the blood tithe. His magic demands it. He keeps people in cages, drains them a pint at a time to make his healing potions. His queen, Sarah, she runs the ledgers, decides who bleeds today." I felt a sickening knot twist in my stomach. Sarah hadn't been a victim. She had adapted. She had become the accountant of Derek's atrocity. "Why is he hoarding so much?" I pressed, needing to know his endgame. "What is he building?" "He's not just building," the woman whispered, looking around as if Derek could hear us through the howling wind. "He's hunting. A week ago, his eyes started flashing red. He announced a bounty, said his system gave him a legendary quest. He's looking for a man with an iron pendant, a teardrop. He said whoever brings him the pendant gets a lifetime supply of food and a place in his inner circle." I froze inside my heated suit. The Genesis Vault. The system wasn't just a parasite. It was a localized AI. It had registered the presence of an administrator, key my pendant in the region. It didn't know exactly where I was, but it knew I was close enough to trigger a proximity alert. Derek's system was commanding him to eliminate the administrator and assimilate the vault's infinite space. "He's sending hunting parties south," the bearded man continued. "Hundreds of them. Desperate people willing to kill anyone for that bounty. You need to stay hidden, stranger." "Thanks for the tip," I said, my voice dangerously calm. I turned and began the long trek back up the mountain. Hiding was no longer an option. If Derek was sending hundreds of scavengers to scour the mountains, it was only a matter of time before someone stumbled upon my bunker's exhaust vents or thermal footprint. I couldn't wait for him to find me. In my past life, I had played defense trying to appease the system and avoid conflict. It had gotten me a crowbar to the skull. I pressed my thumb against the iron pendant beneath my suit. The chiming voice of the vault echoed in my mind. "Administrator, how may I assist?" "Inventory check," I muttered as I walked through the blinding blue blizzard. "Access the heavy munitions I bought from Cobb. It's time to go to Pittsburgh. The butcher has a date with the administrator." The preparation took less than 24 hours. Inside the Genesis Vault, I stood before the heavy munitions crates I had procured from Cobb's gray market network. In my previous life, I had fought with rusted pipes and scavenged kitchen knives. Today, I was an armory walking. I bypassed the standard infantry gear and walked toward a massive, tarp-covered shape in Sector 4 of my warehouse. I pulled the heavy canvas back, revealing a customized military-grade tracked snowcat. It was originally designed for Antarctic research expeditions, heavily up-armored, and ran on a massive diesel engine. I had spent a fortune retrofitting it with reinforced plow blades and thermal optic cameras. With a thought and a touch of the iron pendant, I stored the snowcat in my active inventory, along with 50 drums of diesel crates of incendiary ammunition and enough C4 explosives to level a city block. I left the bunker at dawn. The sky was an endless, suffocating canvas of bruised purple and gray. The temperature hovered at a deadly -65. I materialized the snowcat on the icy mountain ridge, climbed into the heated cabin, and began the brutal drive north toward Pittsburgh. The journey was a tour through a frozen hell. The highways were graveyards of snow-entombed vehicles. Occasionally, I saw clusters of husks standing perfectly still in the blizzards, their blue glowing veins pulsing rhythmically beneath the ice on their skin. They didn't attack the snowcat. The heavy machinery was too large, and the engine noise disoriented them. They simply turned their glowing eyes toward me as I plowed through the wreckage. It took 3 days of relentless driving to reach the outskirts of Pittsburgh. I parked the snowcat in a collapsed highway tunnel overlooking the industrial district and hiked the rest of the way to a vantage point. Through my thermal binoculars, I surveyed Derek's empire. The old steel mill had been transformed into a medieval fortress. Massive, jagged walls of scrap metal shipping containers and poured concrete encircled the perimeter. The system's influence was obvious. No human crew could have built those fortifications in 2 months without heavy machinery, which had all frozen solid. Derek had used the system's build points to magically fuse the materials together, creating a crude, impenetrable barrier. Plumes of black smoke billowed from the central foundry. It was the only source of immense heat in the city, fueled by whatever or whoever Derek's scavengers dragged back. Surrounding the perimeter were hunting parties. I watched a group of 20 heavily armed men and women trudging through the snow, dragging sleds loaded with scavenged electronics and copper wire. They looked miserable, half-starved, and terrified. They were slaves working for the privilege of standing near the foundry's warmth. I didn't plan on sneaking in like a rat. I was the administrator. I possessed spatial dominance. I waited until nightfall, when the temperature dropped to -80, and the patrols huddled close to the perimeter burn barrels. I approached the western wall, a towering barricade constructed from stacked, rusted shipping containers. 2 heavily armed guards paced the catwalk above their breath, pluming in the freezing air. I stepped out from the shadow of a ruined building directly into their line of sight. "Hey, halt!" one of the guards shouted, racking the bolt of his rifle. "Drop your weapons and state your tribute." I didn't slow down. I kept walking toward the massive steel wall. "I said, halt, you frozen freak!" the guard yelled, aiming directly at my chest. He fired. The bullet sparked harmlessly off the reinforced ceramic plating of my Arctic exoskeleton. I didn't even flinch. I reached the base of the shipping container wall. "What the hell is he wearing?" The second guard panicked, leaning over the railing. "Shoot him in the head." Before they could adjust their aim, I pressed my gloved hand flat against the frozen, rusted metal of the bottom shipping container. I tapped the iron pendant beneath my suit. "Store in vault." The bottom container instantly vanished. Gravity did the rest. With a deafening metallic shriek, the structural integrity of the wall collapsed. The containers above it plummeted downward, twisting and crashing into the snow. The catwalk shattered. The 2 guards screamed as they were thrown into the twisted wreckage buried beneath tons of collapsing steel. A massive gaping hole now stood in the butcher's impenetrable fortress. Alarms began to wail across the compound. Sirens cut through the howling wind. Floodlights snapped on, sweeping across the breach. I didn't rush. I simply stepped through the rubble, drawing my AR-15. Inside the compound was a nightmare of chaotic industry. Hundreds of shivering scavengers were backing away in terror, dropping their tools. Armed enforcers, wearing blue armbands, Derek's elite guard, were sprinting toward the breach, assault rifles raised. They expected a rival army. They expected a horde of husks. They didn't expect one man walking calmly through the smoke. I raised my rifle and fired. The incendiary rounds tore through the freezing air, like miniature comets striking the lead enforcers. The specialized ammunition ignited on impact, burning through their cheap armor. They went down, screaming. The rest of the guards opened fire, but I had already touched a wrecked forklift beside me, storing it, and instantly materialized a massive 5-ton concrete highway barrier from my vault directly in front of me. Their bullets chipped uselessly against my instant cover. I was playing a completely different game. They were surviving a system. I was administrating reality. I stepped around the barrier, returning fire with lethal precision, carving a direct path toward the glowing, smoke-choked heart of the foundry. The inner courtyard of the steel mill was a circle of Dante's Inferno. The heat emanating from the central blast furnace was so intense it melted the snow within a 100-yard radius, creating a swamp of boiling, muddy sludge. But it wasn't the heat that made me stop in my tracks. It was the cages. Dozens of rusted animal pens, scavenged from an abandoned zoo or shelter, lined the perimeter of the courtyard. Inside them were people. They were stripped to their undergarments, shivering violently despite the proximity to the furnace. Every single one of them had a crude, thick IV needle jammed into their arm. Clear plastic tubing ran from their veins into large, sterilized glass vats that glowed with a faint, sickeningly sweet blue luminescence. This was the blood tithe. Derek's system required massive biological energy to sustain his superhuman stats and rapid healing. He wasn't just draining them. The system was refining their life force into consumable potions. It was industrial vampirism. I shot the locks off the nearest cages, ignoring the blaring alarms around me. The prisoners were too weak, too hollowed out to even run. They just stared at me with dead, sunken eyes. "Hold on," I told a young man who was practically a skeleton. I pulled a pair of heavy bolt cutters from the vault and severed his IV line. When the shooting stops, head for the breach in the west wall. I didn't have time to be a savior right now. I had to cut off the head of the snake. I kicked open the heavy metal doors, leading to the mill's administrative offices. The air inside was stifling, smelling heavily of ozone, old blood, and cheap perfume. The enforcers hadn't made it this far back yet. They were all scrambling toward the breach I had created. I moved silently down the hallway, my rifle raised. At the end of the corridor, a frosted glass door, marked manager, had a warm light spilling from beneath it. I approached it, hearing the frantic shuffling of paper and the clicking of a keyboard. I slammed my boot into the door, shattering the lock and sending the wood flying inward. Sarah shrieked, dropping a stack of ledgers. She was standing behind a massive mahogany desk, furiously stuffing gold jewelry, silver coins, and small vials of glowing blue liquid into a canvas duffel bag. I lowered my rifle slightly, staring at the woman I had once almost married. The apocalypse had changed her, but not in the way it had changed the people in the cages. Sarah looked healthy. She was wearing a thick, luxurious fur coat over a tailored cashmere sweater. Her hair was clean, pulled back tightly, but the proximity to Derek's parasite had corrupted her. Her skin had a pale, waxy pallor, and her eyes darted with a paranoid, rat-like intensity. When she saw me, her jaw dropped. The terrified scream died in her throat. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice trembling with sheer disbelief. She looked at my pristine, high-tech Arctic suit. She looked at the polished, expensive weapon in my hands. She looked at my face, clean-shaven, healthy, and completely untouched by the starvation and horror that defined her world. "How?" she stammered, backing away from the desk. "You're supposed to be dead. You didn't have a system. You had nothing." "I had a lot more than you thought, Sarah," I said, stepping into the room and closing the broken door behind me. I glanced at the ledger on her desk. It was a list of names crossed out with red ink. Beside each name were volume measurements: pints, quarts, gallons. "You're the accountant." I noted my voice, laced with disgust. "You decide who goes in the cages." I had to," she cried, tears instantly springing to her eyes. She played the victim, flawlessly falling back on old habits. "Derek made me do it, Caleb. He's a monster. The system turned him into a psycho. He hits me. He forces me to run the numbers. You have to save me." She took a step toward me, reaching out a trembling hand. "We can leave together. You look so strong, Caleb. We can escape." I looked at her outstretched hand, feeling absolutely nothing. In my first life, I had died trying to protect her. I had taken a crowbar to the skull so she could have my last can of peaches. "Save it, Sarah," I said coldly. "I saw you counting the gold while the alarms went off. You weren't a prisoner. You were a parasite, feeding off a parasite." Her victim facade vanished in an instant. Her face twisted into an ugly, hateful snarl. Her hand darted beneath the mahogany desk, pulling out a compact submachine gun. "Derek is going to tear you apart," she screamed, raising the barrel. She never got the chance to pull the trigger. I didn't even raise my rifle. I simply tapped the pendant and accessed a flashbang grenade I had stored without its pin. I dropped it at her feet. The detonation in the confined office was blinding and deafening. Sarah screamed, dropping the gun and clutching her hands over her eyes, collapsing to the floor in a heap. I walked past her writhing body, kicking the submachine gun out of reach. I didn't kill her. Being left blind and helpless in a fortress whose walls had just fallen surrounded by the slaves she had tortured was a far more fitting justice. I approached the heavy steel blast doors at the back of the office. Beyond them lay the catwalks over the main foundry. The heat radiating from the metal was blistering. I racked a fresh round into my AR-15. Derek was waiting. I kicked open the heavy steel blast doors, stepping out onto the suspended, grated catwalk that circled the main foundry. The heat hit me like a physical blow, a staggering wall of 150-degree air that instantly caused the ceramic plating of my suit to hiss. Below me, the massive blast furnace roared an open maw of liquid orange fire that illuminated the cavernous industrial space in a hellish flickering light. Standing at the edge of the molten steel vat, stripped to the waist, was Derek. He didn't look human anymore. The system had demanded too much, forcing his biology to mutate to accommodate the sheer volume of artificial stats he had hoarded. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his muscles grotesquely swollen and corded like twisted steel cables. His skin was a translucent, sickly pale gray, webbed with thick, pulsing neon blue veins. The blue glow emanating from his eyes was blinding, trailing like smoke in the sweltering air. He looked up at the catwalk, an arrogant, blood-stained grin spreading across his face. "I wondered who was causing all that noise." Derek boomed his voice, vibrating with an unnatural digitized bass. "I should have known it was you, Caleb. You always were a stubborn cockroach. I don't know how you got your hands on military gear, but you just saved my hunters a lot of time." I walked slowly down the metal stairs, my rifle aimed directly at his chest. "Your fortress is gone, Derek. Your guards are dead or running. It's over." He threw his head back and laughed, a horrible metallic sound that echoed over the roar of the furnace. My guards. They were fodder. They gathered scrap so I didn't have to freeze my hands. You think I need a fortress? I am the fortress Caleb. The system chose me. I'm a level 40 vanguard. I have stats you couldn't even comprehend. He raised his right hand. The air around his fist distorted, fracturing into sharp, blue geometric polygons. A massive, jagged broadsword, made of glowing, materialized energy, formed in his grip. The system told me an administrator key was in the area. Derek sneered, stepping away from the furnace. It said, "Whoever holds the iron pendant is hoarding infinite resources. I'm going to take it off your corpse, Caleb. I'm going to assimilate your dimension, and then I'm going to rule this frozen rock. This. You don't understand what you're a host to," I said, stopping at the base of the stairs, 20 feet away from him. "It's not a blessing. It's a localized parasite. You're just its battery, Derek. Look at yourself. You're a monster. I'm a god," he roared. Derek lunged. The sheer kinetic force of his movement cracked the concrete floor beneath his bare feet. He crossed the 20-foot gap in a fraction of a second, the glowing broadsword sweeping in a lethal horizontal arc, aimed perfectly at my neck. I didn't try to dodge. I didn't try to block. I simply tapped the iron pendant beneath my armor. Store in vault. I didn't store his sword. I stored the space directly in front of me. I touched a 10-ton steel shipping container filled with solid concrete that I had taken from his outer wall and materialized it instantly into the space between us. Derek's glowing blade slammed into the concrete block with a deafening crack. The magical weapon bit deep into the stone, but the sheer density halted his momentum completely. He let out a grunt of surprise. Before he could pull the blade free, I stepped out from behind the container and fired point blank. 3 incendiary rounds struck him in the chest. They exploded on impact, showering him in white-hot thermite. Derek stumbled backward, roaring in pain, but the blue veins on his skin flared brilliantly. The system was rapidly burning through his stolen blood tithe potions, aggressively healing the charred flesh right before my eyes. "Is that all you've got?" he screamed, his eyes flashing red. "System skill, berserker's charge." He abandoned the stuck sword, dropping his shoulder, and charged at me like a freight train. He was too fast. I tapped the pendant again, pulling a heavy forklift from my inventory and dropping it directly in his path. Derek slammed into the forklift, shattering the heavy machinery into a shower of sparks and twisted metal, barely slowing down. He hit me square in the chest. The impact threw me backward through the air. I crashed hard into a brick support column, my exoskeleton groaning under the immense pressure, saving my ribs from being instantly pulverized. I slid to the ground, gasping for breath. Derek was stalking toward me, his fists glowing with kinetic energy. "You have no magic, Caleb. You're just a delivery boy bringing me my prize." He was right about one thing. I didn't have combat magic. I couldn't heal instantly, and I couldn't conjure energy swords. But I was the administrator. I controlled reality. "You're right, Derek," I wheezed, forcing myself to my feet. "I don't have magic, but I do understand physics." I looked past him, directly at the massive, towering blast furnace that was keeping the entire interior of the steel mill at a sweltering 150 degrees. "You mutated your body to survive the power of the system," I said, my voice cold. "Your pores are wide open. Your blood is boiling to process the healing. You need this heat." Derek paused, his glowing eyes narrowing in confusion. "What are you talking about?" I raised my right hand, pointing my palm not at him, but at the massive, roaring furnace behind him. I funneled every ounce of my willpower into the iron pendant, pushing its spatial parameters to the absolute maximum. Store in vault. The air in the foundry violently imploded. With a deafening vacuum whoosh, the entire blast furnace, thousands of tons of brick steel, and boiling liquid magma instantly vanished from reality, safely transported into Sector 8 of my pocket dimension. The immediate absence of the massive heat source created a catastrophic thermal shockwave. The ambient air from the apocalyptic world outside a biting negative 80 degrees rushed in through the collapsed roof and the breached walls to fill the vacuum. In less than 3 seconds, the temperature inside the foundry plummeted over 200 degrees. Derek didn't even have time to scream. His hyper-elevated body temperature collided with the instant deep freeze, absolute zero. The moisture on his skin, the sweat pouring down his face, and the boiling blood rushing through his dilated, pulsing blue veins froze solid in a fraction of a heartbeat. I watched as the Vanguard-class host locked up entirely. His skin turned a horrifying shade of brittle frosted white. The glowing blue light in his eyes flickered, sputtered, and died. He stood there for 5 seconds, perfectly frozen, like a grotesque ice sculpture. Then, the immense internal pressure of his expanding frozen blood caused his mutated musculature to fail. With a sharp cracking sound, like a glacier breaking apart, Derek shattered. He collapsed into a pile of red and blue ice shards on the grated floor. I stood in the freezing silence, my breath pluming in the icy air. I walked over to the pile of shattered remains. Among the ice, a single glowing blue geode rested the system core, now dormant without a host. I tapped my pendant, storing the core deep within the darkest, most isolated corner of my vault, where no one would ever touch it again. I turned my back on the ruins of the blue-eyed butcher's empire, pulled my collar tight against the howling wind, and began the long walk back to the mountains. The apocalypse was far from over, but the administrator had finally logged in. That's how I ended my brother's tyrannical reign and used the ultimate cheat code to outsmart a parasitic system in a world frozen over and overrun by monsters playing by the rules will only get you killed. If you want to see what happens next as I rebuild society from my underground bunker and what I discovered hiding inside that dormant system core, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your squad. Drop a comment below. If you found the meteorite and the pendant, which one are you choosing? Stay warm, survivors, and I'll see you in part 10.